Hello guys, how's it going? I hope you're all doing well. Welcome back to my true crime YouTube channel where I go into all the details of a true crime case whilst I do my makeup. Just before we do get into the video, I feel I should give a quick content warning that we are going to be discussing some pretty dark topics in today's video, such as murder, weapons and paedophilia. So if you are at all unsure about this video or feel it might affect you in any way whatsoever, please do feel free to click off and watch something else. I'd also like to give a disclaimer that all the information I've compiled in this video has been sourced from the internet, news reports and family statements. And although I research each case as thoroughly as I can before each video, and of course it is never my intention to spread misinformation or cause offence to anybody involved, please do let me know down below if you see any false information. So with that, let's get right into the case. So obviously every case that I cover on this channel has some kind of aspect to it which is either traumatizing or just kind of generally messed up. But something about the case that we're going to be covering today just kind of stands out to me as being even more sort of disturbing, mainly because the person who actually committed this murder was in such a position of power and kind of authority over the victim. So to start off this case, we're going to introduce Jordan Watson, who was born in Carlisle, which is in the north of England. In fact, it's so far north that it's almost in Scotland. It's about as far north as you can go while still being in England. So Jordan's parents said that he was kind of your typical 14-year-old boy. He loved going out and spending time with his mates and playing football. He supported Liverpool and loved watching all their games and supporting them. And he was also a bit of a troublemaker, as lots of 14-year-old boys are. But one thing that everybody did say about Jordan was just that he had a really good heart. He was exceptionally protective over his siblings, especially his younger sister, who he was always kind of standing up for and making sure that she was okay. He had a great sense of humour. He just seemed like a great guy to spend time with. At the time of this case, Jordan did actually have a girlfriend as well. She was the same age as him, so she was 14, and the two of them seemed to have a very, very sweet relationship. They got on very well, and he clearly absolutely adored her. I'm not actually going to be saying her name in this video. Her name isn't actually available online, so I don't even know it. I'm guessing that's for privacy reasons, but make sure to remember her because she plays quite a key role in this case. So Jordan just kind of seemed to be your normal 14-year-old boy. He went to school, he played football, but one thing that kind of set Jordan apart from other boys his age was that he'd actually made a couple of friends who were several years older than him. And the one who's sort of most notable within this case is George Thompson. So George Thompson was 19 years old. He was 5 years older than Jordan. And from what I could kind of tell online, it seems that George had been the one who'd kind of approached Jordan and sort of started the friendship. And as I guess most sort of young teenagers would do, Jordan really, really looked up to George. He saw him kind of as like an older brother figure, and he just kind of wanted this guy to think that he was cool and someone worth spending time with. So the two of them had become pretty good friends around the time of this case, and Jordan actually quite frequently went over to George's house as well, where they sort of hung out and did, I guess, teenage boy kind of stuff, played games, chatted. But when Jordan started going around to George's house, this is when things kind of start to go downhill in this case. George had actually started running several illicit businesses, which I believe included mainly drug sales and weapons sales. And in exchange for getting a cut of the sales, George actually offered Jordan kind of a job, I guess, helping him out with these sales. And so Jordan, who was obviously still, trying to impress his new friend, accepted. This job would obviously have made Jordan quite a bit of money, quite a bit more money than he would likely have been getting from his parents at the time or from if he were to, get a job. He was only 14 at this time, so this would have been a large amount of money. And also it meant that he would be spending more time with George, he would seem cool, he would be invited along to all the kind of parties that George was going to. It just kind of seemed like a bit of a win-win. However, through all of this, little was Jordan to know that George actually had no interest whatsoever in being his friend, and the only reason that George was choosing to spend any time at all with Jordan was in order to get closer to Jordan's girlfriend. And yes, that's Jordan's 14-year-old girlfriend. George had actually been making advances on Jordan's girlfriend for quite some time before Jordan and George even became friends, but he was repeatedly being turned down as Jordan's girlfriend said that she wasn't interested in anything further than being friends. Jordan's girlfriend had actually been round to George's house several times herself, but she'd never gone on her own. She'd always been with friends, or most often with Jordan. And she said that pretty much whenever she was over and Jordan was out of the room, George was repeatedly flirting with her and calling her beautiful and just basically trying to make advances on her. So by this point, you can probably kind of figure out the vibe of this friendship. Jordan had absolutely no idea what was going on between George and his girlfriend, but it seems that the more Jordan's girlfriend rejected George, the more determined he was to kind of have her. And all of this came to a peak on the night of the 15th of June 2015. So on this day, the 15th of June 2015, Jordan's girlfriend actually went over to George's house alone. And I'm not quite sure why she went on her own. I don't think she'd ever been over there on her own before. But on this day, the kind of dynamic between the two of them seemed to be very, very similar to what it had been before. George was still making these moves on her, telling her that she was beautiful and that if they were together, he would treat her like a princess, and basically just kind of suggesting that she should cheat on Jordan with him. And she was still repeatedly turning him down and saying this wasn't something she was interested in. But this guy basically just didn't really seem to be able to get the hint. I guess that after a while of this, Jordan's girlfriend started to get kind of a bit uncomfortable, as you would, and she ended up leaving George's house and going to meet Jordan, and the two of them met at a chip shop, which was quite near Jordan's house, before the two of them went back to Jordan's house and spent time chatting in his room. So that evening, they just kind of sat and chatted in Jordan's room. There wasn't really anything out of the ordinary. But then at around 11 p.m, Jordan took a phone call who Jordan's girlfriend thought was from George. And the phone call really didn't go on for very long. It was like a 5-minute call. But after he got off the phone, Jordan told his girlfriend that he needed to go and meet George to help him with one of the deals that George had asked him to help with. So the two of them left Jordan's house and Jordan's girlfriend went home while Jordan went off to go and meet George. So George had asked Jordan to meet him in a cemetery, which was near both of their houses, which is a bit of an odd place to meet. But George had told Jordan that they were meeting a man who they were going to sell some weapons to, and police have actually figured out now that this was a complete lie. There was no man coming. But this was basically the start of George's plan to lure Jordan into the graveyard. So at this point, Jordan and George were both making their way to the cemetery, and actually these two weren't the only people who were going. A 19-year-old by the name of Bran Finley had also been brought along by George, as he had scammed George during a street-level drug deal where he basically hadn't paid George for some drugs that he bought, and he wasn't able to pay George this money, so kind of to pay off this debt, George had told him to come along to this weapons sale. And for whatever reason, Bran didn't want to go to the cemetery on his own. I don't really blame him. So he brought along his friend, Daniel Johnston. So at this point, there are 4 boys heading to the cemetery: Jordan, George, Bran, and Daniel. And they all believe, well, the other 3 boys who aren't George believe that they're going there for a weapons sale, but George has a completely different plan in mind. So once all 4 of these boys had arrived at the cemetery, we don't actually really know what the kind of time frame of everything happening was. There still isn't a complete picture put together of what actually happened. All that we do know is that around midnight, a woman who lived near the cemetery was lying awake in bed when she heard 3 long screams, and these screams sounded like they came from either a child or a young teenager, and she said that these 3 screams went on for quite a while, and that the last one, which lasted the longest, lasted around 15 seconds, and it was followed by just complete silence. There was nothing else. Then at around 11:45, something really weird happens, and that is that Jordan's girlfriend, who is obviously back at home now, receives a message from Jordan's Facebook account saying that they're no longer together. He's breaking up with her basically over message, and he doesn't want to be with her anymore. And obviously, unsurprisingly, this message came as a bit of a shock to Jordan's girlfriend. They'd spent a nice evening together, chatting, and nothing really seemed to be wrong at all. Jordan had showed no sign at all of wanting to break up with her or not being happy with her. And this is when Jordan's girlfriend started to notice something a bit off about these messages. And the first thing that she noticed was that the message contained lots of spelling mistakes, which she knew Jordan wouldn't have made. And not only that, but just the way that the whole message was worded and sent and phrased, she could just tell that it hadn't been written by Jordan. And obviously, since the last thing that she'd heard from Jordan was that he was going out with George, she basically just assumed that this was a bit of a prank that George was playing on her, maybe to see if she'd show interest in him if her and Jordan were broken up, or just to kind of mess her around a bit. But either way, she didn't really take it too seriously. She just thought it was a bit of a joke, and so she ended up just going to bed and probably just assumed that she would talk to Jordan about it the next day. However, little was she to know that she would never get the chance, as at around 7:45 the next morning, a member of the public who was walking her dog in the cemetery came across the body of a 14-year-old boy slumped against a blood-stained tree. The dog walker obviously called the police straight away, and an investigation was started immediately. Pretty much the first thing that the police will do when handed a murder investigation is try to get in contact with those who are closest to the victim, and it really didn't take the police very long to figure out that Jordan had spent his last hours in the company of his girlfriend and then George Thompson. So George Thompson was one of the first people to be brought in by police for questioning, and although he did cooperate with them, he answered all the questions that he was asked, and he didn't sort of fight against the police, I guess, with their questions. He was just completely lying through his teeth throughout the whole interview. He basically told police that he hadn't been in contact with Jordan that evening, he hadn't seen him, and this was actually stuff that the police already knew. They knew that he'd been with Jordan, they knew that they'd been at the cemetery, so he was kind of just digging himself a bit of a hole at this point. But anyway, the police decided to search through George's phone records to see, who he'd been in contact with that evening, where he'd been, and sure enough, they found texts firstly between Jordan and George telling him to meet them at the cemetery, and also between Bran and George kind of arranging for Bran to come to the cemetery as well. There is so much information which police are able to get from a phone about your location and who you've contacted and what you've been doing, further than just like the obvious things like social media and call history. And I honestly do think that if you are guilty of a crime and the police somehow get hold of your phone, you're pretty much done for. And so in this case, the police had all the information about who Jordan had contacted in his final hours, where he'd been, what he'd said, what plans were made, and alongside that, the police also had the location history of all 4 of the boys. So it was pretty much just an open and shut case. They were pretty sure they had their suspects. So now that the police were pretty sure that they had their suspects, they had the people that were responsible for the crime, the only thing to figure out was why? What was the motive? Why had these 3 boys suddenly decided to kill this 14-year-old boy in a cemetery in the middle of the night? What had happened? And so the police decided to get in contact with and question the one person that both Jordan and George had been in contact with in the hours before Jordan's death, and that was, of course, Jordan's girlfriend. So when the police brought in Jordan's girlfriend, they asked her whether she knew any possible motive whatsoever for why Jordan could have been so brutally murdered. They asked her about her relationship with Jordan, her friendship with George, and also whether George had ever showed any romantic interest in her. And this last question is what they put a lot of emphasis on. And of course, Jordan's girlfriend had to say that yes, George had showed an awful lot of interest in her in the time that Jordan and George had become friends. But one thing that she was adamant about was that she had repeatedly turned him down. The other people that the police brought in for questioning were Bran and Daniel, who had obviously both been at the cemetery as well at the time of the murder. Bran seemed to take kind of the same tack as George. He cooperated with the police and answered all their questions, but he was completely lying as well. And Daniel actually just completely refused to answer any questions at all. He was just sat there, completely blank, emotionless, and silent. Upon further investigation, the police were pretty much able to figure out that George had been the driving force behind this murder. He was the one who had planned it, and he was the one who mainly wanted Jordan dead. And before he'd actually been brought in for questioning at the police station, George had gone to work as usual, and a colleague who worked closely with George said that he had spent the morning scrolling through the internet and social media looking for reports on Jordan's death. And the worst bit about all of this is apparently whenever he found one, a mention of Jordan or Jordan's murder, he would pump his fist in celebration. A pathologist had found that the cause of Jordan's death was multiple wounds to the head caused by a sharp instrument. And when the police went to search George's house, among obviously all the other weapons that he had there, the police found a blood-stained Gurkha knife underneath George's bed. Everyone who knew him just said that George was a complete fantasist. He claimed to be part of a gang in Manchester and said that he had killed 3 people and also been shot himself, which was, of course, just a huge lie. And pretty heartbreakingly, he had actually apparently told people that he wanted Jordan dead so that he could take his girlfriend as his own. In the end, George Thompson and Bran Finley were both sentenced to life in prison for murder, and Daniel Johnston was sentenced to 10 years in prison for manslaughter. There are honestly so many awful aspects to this case, and it would have affected so many different people, not just Jordan's family and friends. But one person that sort of can't help but stick in my mind with this case is Jordan's girlfriend. I can't even begin to imagine how difficult this would be to go through as an adult, let alone a 14-year-old girl. I really hope that she has people around her to support her and help her move on, and also help her to remember the good memories that she had with Jordan and not let them just be ruined by the actions of one selfish man. Anyway, that is all I have for you on this case. I really hope that you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, then make sure to let me know what you thought down below and let me know if there are any particular cases you'd like me to cover next. As always, don't forget to subscribe and I will see you in the next video. Bye for now.